All
All
right.
right, ready to get started?
Yeah.
Cool. Alrighty. So, hey guys, my name is Nicole. I am a librarian here at Woodbridge. Usually at the main library, I do a lot of the teen stuff. Some of you may or may not recognize me. Um, let me see. Sorry. Um, just a second, my phone is ringing. Well, before I answer my phone, this is my buddy Chris. He's an extremely talented photographer, artist, musician.
Thank
He
you.
does it all. He's really great. I'm super pumped to have him here with us tonight. So, Chris, all you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm so glad to be here. Once again, my name is Kris Khunachak. I am a photographer slash videographer in the central New Jersey, New York area. I've been doing this for like 2.5, almost 3 years. I do a lot of I used to do a lot of concert photography. I still do some band promotional photography. I have my own studio where I do portrait photography. And then also my day job is with a luxury goods brand where we sell pens. So I end up doing some product photography while I'm there. It's really fun. It's really fun. I originally went to school for graphic design and I took some classes where I sort of dabbled in photography, and it was there that kind of planted the seed in my mind that this could be another form of self-expression and something that could really activate my creativity. And eventually that just sprouted into something that became my full-blown, both full-time and freelance profession. So I'm really excited that y'all are here to learn a bit about that and give me a platform for me to share the things that I know, some objective facts about photography. I'm going to be going from like square one basics into sort of more in-depth stuff about how I edit my photos. And yeah, it's going to be really cool. So give me a sec here. This is to humanize me a bit. This is the first time I'm sort of teaching what I know in a classroom setting. I have my notes here, so you're going to catch me looking down towards them every once in a while. But thank you in advance for bearing with me. All right, so today, basically, like I said, I'm going through a crash course of some of the most important aspects of capturing a well-exposed and thoughtfully focused image. Then I'm going to give you a glimpse of how I capture, process, and edit those photos. Now, something that's important to note is there's like a million ways to do this, and honestly, there's no one right way to do it or best way. But hopefully by getting to witness my process and the fundamentals of why I do what I do, you can be informed and you can use that to sort of determine what works best for you in the world of photography and understanding your camera. As a preface today, a lot of what I'll be explaining is from the standpoint of having a interchangeable lens camera. This is the camera that I use. It's a Sony. It's a great camera. I love using it, but obviously there are sort of brand specific and medium specific features across different brands, but a lot of what I will be explaining is universal across different platforms and different cameras. In addition, when I'll be editing, that's in Adobe Lightroom, which is a specific professional photo editing software, but a lot of the features and adjustments are universal to things like the Apple Photos app or whatever, any other kind of photo app that you prefer to use. The terminology is often the same. So let me share my screen real quick and get into my prepared slides. Share. Nicole, can you confirm that it looks good to go?
I just shoved my mic up between these two masks. Technology. Yeah, looks good to me.
Awesome. All right. So continuing on, how to get great photos with your new camera. The first and most important thing I would say is getting good exposure. Exposure is how much light reaches the sensor of your camera. Every camera behind the lens has a sensor that is exposed to light at the moment that you take a photo. A lot of the controls that I'll be going into all determine exactly how much light and how quickly that light reaches the sensor. You'll see the next bullet point is maximize your dynamic range. What I mean by that is every camera has a sort of range of data that it can capture, from shadows to highlight. So think from really dark places to like looking at the sun. It can only capture so much image in between those two extremes. So getting a good exposure is setting your camera in such a way that you sort of maximize what the camera is able to see. You don't want the image to be too bright or too dark. And I have a couple examples to start with for here. So over here, I was in the park the other day and I took a bunch of photos and I just adjusted the settings over time from the same spot. And you'll see that this image looks a lot better than these two images. These images are overexposed and the next two images, oh, this one's okay. You could definitely work with that in editing, and we'll get to how much you could save images in editing. But it's a little darker, and then this is maybe a little too dark. You'll see some of the detail in the trees is lost to complete and utter darkness. So a lot of what I'll be explaining for the next several minutes is going to be about getting good, accurate exposure. So those three pillars, the three main, most important controls of getting that exposure is shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And we will be getting into that, starting with shutter speed. So shutter speed is basically determined by a mechanism that is in front of every camera sensor that opens and closes for a predetermined period of time. You control this. You control how long that the mechanism is open when you click the shutter button and you take a photo. It's represented in the camera as fractions of a second. You'll see here it's like 1/125th of a second, 1/640th of a second, 1/8000th of a second. That's very fast. Cameras can of course be set up to like 30 seconds if it's like really dark and you want to capture the galaxy or the Milky Way or something, astrophotography. Let's see here. Continued. Basically, the practical way to use this information and to know shutter speed is that the faster the shutter speed you have, the more sharply that you can capture fast movement, like a race car or a car on the highway. You want to use a very quick and low shutter speed, like I mentioned before, like 1/8000th of a second, like that end of the spectrum, to capture a fast moving object with minimal motion blur. You want to use a slower shutter speed to gather more light for dark scenes, or to say smooth out water, or get like the trails of light that you see from the taillights of a car. Because a slower shutter speed is basically capturing motion over time. So yeah, it's like from the moment that the shutter opens to the shutter closes, if a car is traveling across the entire frame, then you're going to get a blur of a car in your photo because it's capturing like a second of time in one single image. If you're shooting handheld, my personal limit is around 1/160th of a second. You know, the longer that your shutter speed is, the more susceptible it is, the camera is, to shaking and blurriness. And so if you don't have steady hands, you might have a smaller thresholds of shutter speed time than me, but I tend to find that to be my personal limit, but you can sort of feel that out as you go. I have now a few examples of those concepts in practice. So here you'll see I have a photo of basically a still life setup that I made earlier. And this is going to be sort of, you'll see this throughout my presentation. I'll move my cursor over to where you can see the variables change. You'll see this photo is at 1/320th of a second. Move on over to 1/100th of a second, which is a greater increment of time. You see that the image is now brighter. This stands to reason with what I just explained to you. Now that's 1/50th of a second. This is 1/20th of a second. This is getting a little bright. But that's just sort of, you know, a very basic explanation of shutter speed specific effects on an image. Obviously nothing is moving in this image, so there's not risk of motion blur, but you get the idea. Now, speaking of motion blur, you'll see I have my hand in this frame here. For this next set of photos, I basically changed the shutter speed for every photo, but then I basically compensated so that the light level is the same across all the photos using other settings, which I will explain. But what this will show you is just isolating the difference in potential motion blur. So if I move the cursor again over here, 1/400th of a second, my hand is actually waving. I was waving my hand in front of the camera at this point in time. But because the increment of time is so short, 1/400th of a second, it didn't capture any motion blur. It just looked like a still photo of my hand. But as we increase the shutter speed to 1/200th of a second, you'll see there's a little bit of blur there. And then this is 1/80th of a second, even more. And then 1/13th of a second, which is quite a while. And you'll see it captured more of the range of my movement because I was able to wave my hand like maybe 2 or 3 times in the span of 1/13th of a second. That is how you get these images of like waterfalls where the water is like milky smooth. It's because these people have their cameras on tripods and are exposing the scene for a much longer period of time. So you're not getting individual droplets. You're just getting a clean stream of water. Now, moving on to aperture, which is the second pillar of getting good exposure. Basically, every single lens, whether it's interchangeable on the camera or not, has an iris that opens up a certain amount to allow light to pass through. What this means is that there are a bunch of blades inside the lens that kind of open up and close, and it is entirely controllable within the camera. You determine how wide the open is at the moment that the photo is taken. The size of the opening is represented as f-stops. You'll see this in your camera settings as something that reads like f5.6, f2.8, f1.8. And basically what these numbers are, well, they don't much correlate to the actual physical like millimeter or inch size of the opening, but all that you need to know is that the smaller the number is, the wider the opening is. And these f-stops, as you see here, I write that they are standard across all lenses. So what that means is that if you have a Canon T3 and you're using a Canon 50mm f1.8 lens, that lens is opening up to 1.8, the exact same size as like a Nikon f1.8 lens. F-stops are standard across brands. So the practical application of this knowledge, again, is that wider apertures, which are smaller numbers in f-stops, take in more light because the lens is opening up wider. And what this does is actually creates a shallower depth of field. And we'll get to depth of field in a bit, but just know that. And then narrower apertures, which are the larger numbers going to like f11, I don't know, 16, those take in much less light because the opening is much smaller, but it creates a deeper depth of field. So you will have more in focus. I said 2 seconds ago, what I was going to get the depth of field. Here it is. So depth of field is basically the amount of physical space in front of the camera that appears to be in focus, at things that are sharp and are the focus of the image. And there's like a minimum range and a maximum range of any given depth of field. And there are a lot of variables that determine this, from the focal length of your lens to the size of your sensor. But just know that aperture is directly linked to your depth of field. And you'll get a feel for the consequences of this as you begin to experiment with your own camera, and also as you begin to see some of the examples that I have prepared. So next over here, we have a series of images where all the settings are constant except for the aperture. So you'll see here, this was shot at f1.8, which is relatively shallow. It's letting in a good bit of light. So you'll see if I zoom in, the nib of this fountain pen is in focus, but the depth of field is so shallow that you move even a couple inches back and you're out of focus. So really the depth of field is really drawing you to a singular object here. And that is a consequence of the aperture, and things along the same distance away from the camera as the nib would be in focus, but we can't see much of that here. So we move to a different one, f2.8. This is a slightly smaller aperture. You'll see the image is now darker because the opening of the lens is smaller and it's letting in less light. f5, even darker. f11, way too dark. Now, in this next set of images, I've changed the aperture in the same way. I've used the similar values, but now I've compensated for the brightness to level them all out, just as a scientific comparison. So now you'll see specifically the difference in the depth of field. So again, 1.8, we have a sharp nib, blurry just in front of it, blurry just behind it. But as we move on to the next image, this one was shot at f2.8, still blurry, but slightly less so. You can see more of this like telescope is in focus. As we move to f5, again, we have an increase in sharpness. Even this ink bottle all the way back here is starting to be in focus. Present, less so. This lens for sure is in focus. So now we're getting more context in the scene. Now, this last image is f11 and essentially, well, still not this present, which is fine, but you get the idea that now a ton of stuff is in focus, and now you're really getting sort of a nice idea of the entire image, and it's not just about the nib. And then I have a couple more practical examples here. This image shot in a local park of mine was shot at f1.8, and then immediately after, this was shot at f10. And you can immediately tell the difference in how in focus the background is versus the foreground. Same thing with this bench. This was shot at f1.8, and this was shot at f13. And you just see the difference in the background here. It's still relatively out of focus because those things are very far away. But when you just compare it to that, like, the difference is obvious. And with this image, you see you're sort of isolating your attention on the bench a lot more than the other image. So on to the next pillar of good exposure, which is ISO, which stands for International Organization for Standardization. I know, Apple already took iOS, so I guess they had to just swap the letters around. But anyway, the ISO is a digital feature of pretty much every camera that amplifies the sensor's sensitivity to light. What that means is, these cameras these days all have like digital image signal processors and a bunch of stuff that enable them to, process the images differently. And ISO is just something that's always been around as a control that can adjust the sensitivity, again, of that sensor to light. It's represented by numerical values that range from like 100, 200, 400, 800, 1000, 3200. And basically, all you need to know at this point is that the higher the number, the higher the sensitivity to light. And as a result, the brighter the image. And then, vice versa, the lower the number, the less sensitive the sensor is to light. But this comes at a cost. Increasing your ISO increases the amount of grain or noise in the image, which in turn reduces fine detail. I'll show you that in a second. But basically ISO is kind of a way to squeeze a little more light out of your scene. If you're in a really dark room and you're already using the brightest aperture, the widest aperture that your lens is capable of, and you're already maxing out your shutter speed that you're willing to go to, then ISO is like the last bastion of getting a brighter exposure. So ideally, as long as you can control it, you should try to keep your ISO as low as possible to minimize noise and maximize detail. Like I just said, treat it like your last resort to get a brighter image. And this is in most cases. I say this because sometimes, you want a little noise depending on, how much character you want your image to have, because different cameras will apply ISO in different ways, which is my next bullet point. Some cameras handle higher ISO values different than others, and some people like the noise. Some people think it adds character to the image. There's no inherently wrong way to go about it, but if you want to have the cleanest image possible, keep your ISO low. Sometimes, in spite of that, sometimes you just need to get the shot. So boost it and fix it in post. What I mean is that, even if it results in a really, really grainy and borderline unusable image, sometimes it's more important to have gotten the shot at all than to have worried about getting the perfect shot. And a lot of editing software, Lightroom Classic included, have a built-in noise reduction feature. It's not foolproof, but it does help a lot. And it's something that I tend to use a little bit here and there just to taste, because sometimes you, again, want a little bit of noise. An example of that is this image that I took during the summer in a park. And it was in a wooded area, the sun was coming down, and like basically to the human eye when I was taking this photo, it was almost completely dark. It was very, very cool and cold in color temperature. But I decided that, I was taking a hike with this friend of mine, and there was a light in the distance from like a service building or something. And it just looked so cool backlighting her as she was taking a photo of me. And I just wanted to get the shot. I didn't care. My camera was incapable of, my camera and my lens were incapable of compensating enough with shutter speed and aperture for me to get a well-lit image. So I just boosted the ISO as high as I needed it to go, and I was able to take home this image, which ultimately still looks pretty cool, and I'm glad to have it. Now, in practical examples, now you will see a series of images from that still life from before, but this time the only variable that's changing is the ISO. So right here, you'll see this image is at ISO 50. That is basically the minimum that my camera can go to. Different cameras, and even within the same camera, different modes will have different minimum ISOs. But for context, this one is my camera at ISO 50. We move on to ISO 100. It is very slightly brighter, as you can see. Then we have ISO 200 and ISO 400. I could keep going, but that sort of gives you an idea of the difference in brightness between these different ISO values. Again, 50, 100, 200, 400. Now, moving on to the next practical example for ISO. Again, I have kept ISO as the variable that changes across these images, but I've compensated for the differences in brightness using the other settings of the camera, in this case, shutter speed. So what you'll see are a series of 6 images that look similar in lighting level, but you will see different levels of noise and grain because I have increased the ISO to across the board as we move through these images. So for this first image, you'll see it's at ISO 1000. Looks kind of okay. Not really a recognizable noise pattern, especially at this distance. Then we move to ISO 200. It's still relatively clean. Excuse me. Okay, so this first image is at 1000, the next image is at 200. So consider 200 to be the new low. That explains why it would look cleaner. Okay, so this next image is ISO 500. And as we move into the blurry parts, which is where noise might be most apparent, it's still relatively clean. And I'll say some of that has to do with my camera. I find that it does handle noise very well, but I do take it to the extreme as we move forward. Here, you can even sort of see a change as I click between these two images. This is noisier, this is 500, this is 2000. So I'll try and go into an even blurry part of the image. Okay, it resets the position. That's fine. But anyway, so at 2000, you start to see a little more grain here. Ultimately, I think it's still a usable image, especially with the advent of noise reduction. But now we are at 8000, and you can start to see a lot more noise and grain peeking out. And even in the in focus places, you are losing a little bit of detail to noise, essentially. Let me go back real quick to like 200. If you pay attention to the nib area there, then back to 8,000, you can still see a little bit of noise. And I apologize if the sort of the live stream quality doesn't reflect this, but hopefully by the edges of the frame, you are able to tell. And then we have our most extreme example, which is ISO 80,000. I pushed the ISO as far as I could for this camera setting, and you'll see that basically the image is almost unusable. It's a pasty mess. We've lost a ton of detail in the nib. It looks like TV static, basically. And not only that, but the colors have been shifted, I think, a very sort of green direction overall versus obviously this image right here. So that's clean, that's ISO 200, and then that's 80,000 pasty mess. So let's recap on the 3 pillars of exposure. Shutter speed controls how long the sensor is exposed to light. You control that in increments of time, fractions of a second, 1/250th of a second, 1/1000th of a second. And that doesn't have an effect on things like depth of field or anything. Aperture controls how much light can enter the sensor in a given unit of time, again, through the opening of the lens. If the lens is wide open, then it gets a lot of light, say in 1 second, versus opening the aperture a tiny bit for 1 second. You are changing the amount of light that enters per second. And that also in turn changes your depth of field. ISO, as we just mentioned, controls the light sensitivity of the sensor. Because ISO is digital and not a result of physics and physical objects opening and closing, it is imperfect and it adds noise and grain the more that you take advantage of it. But it is not always a bad thing, and sometimes it helps you just get the shot, and we like that. And so I have this metaphor that I have like devised in the course of my time with cameras, and I hope it's effective, but I kind of think it's fun. Basically, think of the act of taking a photo as similar to the act of collecting water in a bucket from a pipe. The aperture is sort of how wide the pipe is. So you can imagine that if the pipe is really wide, then a lot of water can travel through it in a given unit of time. Again, let's use 1 second. Or if the pipe is really narrow, then not a lot can travel through the pipe per second. Shutter speed is how long that you intend to open the valve on this pipe. If you only open it for like a half second, then you're not going to get much water. But if you leave it open for like 30 seconds, you're going to get a lot of water. And I guess I should mention, let's say water is light in this instance, and the bucket is the sensor and your camera. Now, ISO is external to both of those elements, the pipe and the water, of course. ISO is like filling your bucket with dirt. You know, you need to take home a bucket that appears to be full to your village, let's say. And if you want to fake it and you want to not have to take so much water, you can fill your bucket with a bunch of dirt. And so that reduces the amount of water that it takes to fill the bucket. But the more dirt that you use, the murkier and the less usable your water is going to be. So think of it like that. And of course, this last bullet point, experiment. You know, you saw these different examples and the different practical stuff. And you can do that yourself. Mess around with your camera, take the same scene and just change one setting at a time in different increments, and really try to examine the individual differences. And you will begin to build like a sixth sense of what exactly you need to demand of your camera and what settings need to be achieved to get a good exposure. All right. So now we move on to something that goes beyond exposure. These are going to be additional concepts that don't necessarily have to do with light gathering, but will indeed determine sort of the character of your image and can be useful things to keep in mind in the interest of telling a story with your image. The first of these is focus. So focus is extremely important. It's almost as inherent to taking a good photo as good lighting. You know, I feel like a decent many of you would already know what this means. To be in focus is to be sharp, to have detail. It is the area in your frame that appears to be the sharpest, and it's always a predetermined distance away from the camera. This distance is controllable within the camera, and the depth of field that we explained earlier in the aperture discussion is what determines how much is in focus. Say at aperture or at f1.8, you might only have like the area between 1 foot away from your camera and 1.5 feet away from your camera as the plane of focus. And that's very shallow. And that's what results in you seeing an image of someone like, let's go back to this photo real quick. I probably shot this at f1. Yeah, I did at f1.8. So she's in focus, but everything behind her is blurred out because the depth of field is so shallow. So it really isolates the subject from the background. And it was important, it was key that she be in focus. Obviously, with all this noise, it completely destroyed the amount of detail, but she is in fact in focus if you see the sort of the edge lighting and the hair. So now all different, this is just a small note, but different lenses, every lens though has a minimum focus distance, and that is sort of the closest that you can get to an object and still have it be in focus. Longer lenses tend to have further minimum focusing distances, and wider lenses tend to have closer focusing distances. And then there are certain purpose-built lenses that are called macro lenses, which you may have heard of, that allow you to get like an inch away from your subject or so and take like, you know, microscopic levels of photography. Now, different cameras have autofocus versus manual focus, or they have autofocus and manual focus. You can choose between which ones, depending on the camera that you have. And basically, autofocus is putting your trust in the camera's algorithms and its image signal processor to determine what it thinks you want to have in focus. Modern autofocus is great. Modern autofocus is amazing. I am on autofocus at least like 85% of the time. And there are a lot of different settings and things to fiddle with your cameras that will determine how quickly and how accurately your camera will land autofocus. But just know that, you know, depending on the camera you have, it's very much worth implementing. Now, of course, there's manual focus. Manual focus is taking control of this yourself, of course, and it gives you the most power to determine with pinpoint accuracy what's going to be in focus in your image. Say you're taking a picture of a person and you want and they're facing you, face on the camera, and maybe you want their pupils in focus, but not necessarily like their eyebrows, because the eyebrows will actually be physically closer to the camera, even a little bit, it counts. Manual focus is going to make sure that you are able to land that, because you will be in full control. You'll be able to view in your camera screen or its viewfinder that you're landing it exactly where you need it to be. Now, there are a couple different focus modes. These are called drive modes that I want to detail. I need to say that these are a couple of the modes that are available in my camera, but in my experience, they tend to be relatively universal, even if not in name, but to just give you an idea of the concepts. So AFS, autofocus single, basically when you half press the shutter button, it will lock on automatically to the thing that it thinks needs to be in focus, and then it locks it there, that depth of field, that distance away from the camera, that is the focus area. So if you're taking a photo of a car that's coming towards you and you half press the shutter button and it lands autofocus on the car where it is in that exact moment, the car is going to keep moving towards you and it will now be out of focus because the camera will have maintained its focus from the moment that you pressed the shutter button. So this comes in handy in certain instances, like in studios where you want to autofocus on the subject of a portrait photo. They're not going to be moving, but it's just a way to get an immediate like approximation of correct focus. Now, autofocus C, AFC continuous autofocus is a little more advanced than that. When not every camera has this, and then again, between different brands, this can be hit or miss. But most modern cameras, relatively solid. It's worth a shot. Experiment with it. Basically, you half press the shutter button, and for the entire duration of time that you have the shutter button half pressed, the camera will track what an object's moving through the frame, no matter how far or how close it gets from the camera. It will stay to it. It will be glued to it. And then when you fully press on the shutter button, it'll take a photo at that exact depth of field, that distance away from the camera. And ideally, it'll be in focus. So if you're using AFC on a car that's moving towards you and you half press the shutter button, you're going to see that the camera is able to follow and keep the car in focus no matter how far away or how close it is to you, so that when you take the photo, it'll be in focus. And we went over manual focus just now. You'll see, as you see, it gives you full control of the focus distance via, most often, the focus ring on the lens itself. This is pretty much a universal physical feature and attribute of every lens. And then, so in addition to the drive modes of autofocus continuous, autofocus single, manual focus, you have focus area settings, which are likely to be on your camera. Basically, on my camera, the Sony, you have wide, zone, center, and flexible spot. Basically, these words are very sort of self-explanatory once you understand the concept. These areas determine the area of the frame that the camera is going to be examining to find an object to focus on. So with wide, it's basically using almost the entire frame to find something, anything to focus on. That being said, it's not very accurate because it could be anything. If you're taking a picture of a crowd, let's say, you're going to have like 50 people across the entire frame. It's not necessarily going to know which one you want it to focus on, but the idea is that it gets close enough, and then you can sort of fine tune it from there. Zone basically means, or zone lets you control a specific, say, quadrant or third of the screen. You can say only focus on objects on the right side of the frame, only focus on objects on like the top middle of the frame. Your camera is going to have sort of different subdivisions of your frame, your screen, and it'll let you choose which one for the camera to look for something to focus on. Center focus, very self-explanatory. It's like using a targeting reticle, basically. Whatever's at the center of the frame is what the camera, or where the camera is going to attempt to land focus. And then flexible spot is kind of like moving a cursor on your computer. Sometimes some cameras you can use a touchscreen with it. On, say, your iPhone, it's like using tap to focus. You tap on a part of the screen and the camera will attempt to focus on whatever is at that point on the screen. Now, moving on to sort of the practical application of focus. Focus is probably one of the most powerful tools in your settings arsenal to tell a story with your image. The eye is naturally drawn to what's in focus, what's sharpest. And, you know, again, with something like a portrait photo, it makes your eye focus on the person, the subject. If the camera's focus is on the eyes, that's really going to draw you in. You're going to be looking into that with the windows of that person's soul, basically. If you're taking a picture of a flower in a barren field, you want the focus, obviously, to be on the flower. But you know what? I say that, and my next bullet point is that stories can be told with elements that are intentionally out of focus as well. Say like you're watching a horror movie, because this concept extends to video as well. you're watching a horror movie and you're facing someone who's at a desk in their dark bedroom apartment, and in the background, in the darkness, the bedroom door, you see a shadowy figure. In most cases in these movies, that shadowy figure is going to be out of focus. They're going to be blurry, but that's the point, you know. The fact that we can't make them out, it leaves more to your imagination. That just is a more powerful experience that makes the viewer have to process more on their own, and that is often, you know, a good thing. That's often a way to sort of activate the narrative of your photo. It's something to think about, and like I said before, experiment, play around with manual focus, do different things. I have a couple shots here to help sort of visualize, again, that concept. You'll see here, I'm at a very shallow depth of field, 1.8. I'm focused on the barrel of the pen. You see the logo of it, which is TWSBI. And you know what this photo might tell you, say you saw this photo on Instagram in like an ad, you're gonna immediately assume it's either maybe about the ink bottle or the pen or just pen products in general, because they're sort of grouped together, and both of them happen to be in focus, at least for the most part. But if we move to this next image, you'll see the plane of focus has shifted a bit, and now, you know, more towards the front of the nib. Maybe this is now just more about the nib itself, maybe even about the telescope. The ink bottle is basically out of focus except for the cap here, but there's not really much detail in the cap. So now maybe you're just thinking more specifically about the pen. And then with this next image, you'll see the plane of focus has shifted closer to the camera, relatively speaking. And now all these background objects are out of focus, but what's in focus is the present. Now, compositionally, this would be an interesting decision to make because the present is almost entirely out of the frame, but it's now the focus of the image. And maybe there's something to be said about that artistically. Obviously, elements of this fake plant are now in focus too, so you're thinking about that. But basically, the main takeaway, basically the main takeaway here is that your focus and this, consequently, the story of the image is affected by the focus plane. Say, like this. This is a quick little portrait of a dog that I am very endeared to in my life. He's in focus, he's beautiful, he's sharp, your eye is immediately drawn to the dog, and nothing about this fence that's behind him, not even the plants that are in front of him. There's a lot of foreground elements that are out of focus as well. You can kind of guess that there's like just some wooded area behind him, but you know immediately that this image is all about the dog. Whereas this image, which has way more in focus, your eye doesn't necessarily get drawn to anything specifically immediately. Obviously, there's like the leading lines of this path, which kind of draw your eye to the center of the image. But you see that most everything is in focus, even if it's like a tree that's, I don't know, 500 yards away, that one, versus like 10 yards away, like this one. They're both in focus. So what you're getting out of this image is more just the full context of the environment and where I was when I took this photo. There's just another a similar example. Still a little bit out of focus closer to me, but there's still a lot in focus as we move through the depth of the image, deeper into the woods. And, you know, consequently, you're getting a lot more, the viewer has to input a lot more information the more that there's in focus. There's a ton of leaves here that are in focus and lots of individual elements. So, you know, a lot of times as a viewer, you're not going to attempt to register each individual leaf. Of course, you're just going to see the forest, not for the leaves. And again, the overall composition is still what leads your eye into it. Now, focal length is another element and another thing that's in your control that will determine the character of your image. Focal length is basically a function of the lens that you're using. Now, obviously, this doesn't necessarily apply if you're using things like a camera that doesn't have an interchangeable lens, if you're using a phone. But actually, modern solutions have been made for that. Like, you know, if you have an iPhone from 2000, 15 onward, I don't know. They have multiple cameras now. You'll notice there's a wide angle and that there's a portrait angle lens. And these are lenses with different focal lengths. But I'm talking in context of interchangeable lens systems. So the focal length is the distance from the optical center of the lens to the sensor itself. The optical center is basically the point within the lens where all the light from the image is converged to a single point, and then it's reflected back onto the sensor. Not necessarily reflected, but refracted. You don't really have to understand the physics of that or why it is the way it is. All you need to know is the millimeter number that's on the lens when you buy it. It's represented in millimeters from like 50 millimeters to 24 millimeters to 300. And basically, it stands to reason, the greater the number of millimeters, the more zoomed in the lens is, the larger your subject will be in frame. Now, this brings into discussion a few things about the different lenses that you can buy. I'm not going to get into like specific products, or I'm going to try not to get too deep into gear, but this is just something to know. I mean, if you just bought a camera and it came with a kit lens, it's likely to be a zoom lens, which means it can be adjusted from say 18 millimeters to 55 millimeters. That's kind of a standard kit lens zoom range. That's in your control. Now this comes in contrast to prime lenses, which have a fixed focal length. Now, that might sound impractical at first glance, like you can't zoom in, how do you get the subject closer? But a prime purist would tell you just walk closer to your subject. But there's more to it than that. Primes tend to have a wider maximum aperture than zooms. And having a wider aperture, again, if you recall from our previous, earlier in the presentation, wider apertures allow you to get shallower depth of field, which means you're getting more of that, pin sharp person versus blurry background type vibe. Primes make that more accessible at the same price points versus zoom lenses. Zoom lenses tend to have variable maximum apertures. Like at the widest zoom, it can let in a certain amount of light, and then at the furthest zoom, it can only let in a little light. And it's physics. It's hard to design these things. There's like 15 glass elements inside these lenses, and everyone does their best to make a good lens for the consumer. But it's important to know the difference between zooms and primes. Now, talking more specifically about how to classify the different focal lengths, if you have like say a 24 millimeter and below, that's kind of like ultra wide. That's seeing a lot more of the scene. You're even getting some distortion, almost fisheye. And if you're going all the way down to say like 8 millimeters, that is a fisheye lens. Think like 90s skateboard videos and stuff like that, where everything is very round and distorted. It's a cool look. It's got character, but it's not for like your everyday run and gun type situation. 24 to 35 millimeters is sort of your standard wide. If you look at like a lot of street photography and stuff that isn't focused on just one person, that's very often like a 35 millimeter focal length. That's a very standard and versatile focal length for wide environmental stuff like that. Now 50 millimeters is sort of like a gold standard, because I don't have any specific sources or citations, so to speak, but in my experience and in my travels, I've found that the 50 millimeter is sort of like the closest to what basically your eye can see when it comes to distortion of the frame. So like if you take a photo of someone with an 8 millimeter lens, they're going to look all weird and wacky. Their nose is going to be like massive compared to their ears and stuff like that. Now versus a 50 millimeter, you're going to get a very naturalistic representation of a person's face and the proportions. And this, it's not just people. This goes hand in hand if you take a photo of a building or you take a photo of a tree or anything. 50 millimeters leads to a more natural proportion. Now, 85 millimeter, going into that range, that's more of your portrait type application, getting into those lenses. It does, basically it sort of compresses the space in such a way that is a little more flattering than reality, so to speak. You know, obviously all of this is subjective, but in the photography industry, this is kind of where we've all landed at as a rule of thumb. You use longer lenses to take portraits of people, and they end up being a little more flattering to the eye. Even if you yourself can't consciously point it out, you see a beautiful, sharp portrait of someone in a magazine, you know, there's sort of this natural predilection that it looks good and it was likely taken with a portrait lens. Now, 100 millimeters and above, going into like 200, 300 millimeters, a lot of second lenses that people tend to buy are like a 70 to 300 millimeter lens. That is your telephoto, and that is, of course, very useful for getting like wildlife photography, and this is wildlife photography, but more specific, birds and stuff like that, or sports even. You know, obviously maybe you're not going to as many sports gatherings, but in the heyday of it, people at these stadiums are using like 600 millimeter, 1200 millimeter lenses so that they can get right up in the action from the stands. That's how that's useful. Now, what's important to note, very important to note really, is that your focal length, different focal lengths can represent, I should just read it directly. Different focal lengths represent spatial separation differently. Now, what that means is basically if you're using a wide lens like a 24 millimeter, the apparent distance between your subject and the background is going to be greater than if you're using a telephoto. And I'll show you, I have absolutely some examples that explain this that I'll get to in a second. But basically, it's all about sort of how close your subject appears to be to like something behind it, like a person standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, so to speak. If you're using a wide angle lens, the Eiffel Tower might look really small behind them. They might even be smaller than the person that you're taking a photo of. But if you're using a longer lens, like 100 millimeters, then the space between the person and the Eiffel Tower behind them is going to appear to be compressed. And so the Eiffel Tower will be bigger in the frame, and it will look like it is much closer to the person. Now, I can just sort of jump to an immediate example of this to end my blabbering on that subject. But here, you'll see I took a photo of that fake plant from before inside the room that I take all my setup photos. And this, yeah, I'll just tell you, this is a coat and this is a painting on the wall, and you see how large they are in comparison to the plant. Now, I took a similar photo with a wide angle lens, and the thing that I kept constant was the size of the plant itself, because that's the control. And you see with a wide angle lens at the same visual distance from the plant, you are seeing so much more of the room, and the coat and the painting on the wall are much, much smaller. And that is just a result of the optical physics of these lenses. So if you want to compress the space, if you want a mountain in the background to look much larger in comparison to whatever you're taking a photo of, you're going to use a portrait lens, 85 millimeters, which is this photo, or up. If you want to create space, even if you're getting way up in your subject's business, like I am with this plant, then you're going to use a wide angle lens, even if you have to get super close. Let's see here. Okay, so in practical application, obviously, this is another tool in your chest that can help determine what your photo is trying to say and what you want to have shown to your viewer and the story that you want to tell. Using a wider lens provides environmental context, say a person sitting on a busy street. If you're using a wide angle lens at a certain distance, you'll see that they're sitting at a bus stop. You'll see that there's a bank behind them. You'll see that there is a car in front of them. All these elements, innocuous as they may sound, add to the story. But you're asking the viewer to, of course, receive and read all of these things. And this is in contrast to a portrait lens, where you are taking a photo of a specific object and you are isolating them because of the natural physics of the portrait lens. You're getting a shallower depth of field and you're blurring out the background. So now your attention again is focused on the plant and not much else. We keep coming back to that, but you get it. It bears repeating. So now one more practical example I have of this before we move on is that same setup from before. We have the still life, which was taken at 85 millimeters in all cases, including all the previous examples of shutter speed and ISO. So basically, the camera in this scene is on a tripod, and that is the one thing that I kept constant between this and the next photo over here. This is with a 24 millimeter lens, and this is an 85. This just gives you an example of the relative level of zoom that you're getting between 24 and 85 from a camera that is positioned exactly the same way. And you'll see there's even a little bit of spatial distortion. You know, this line on the plank in real life, it's straight, but here there's a little bit of bowing just because the lens has some distortion from being so wide. Now, excuse me, take a sip. The next subject is white balance. Now, white balance is basically a measure of the temperature of light around you, and also a measure of the temperature of light that the camera is going to read. You know, lights in the world, the sun, or the fluorescent light in your room, or the tungsten light, or a candle when the power goes out, they all have a specific temperature to them. And it's a little counterintuitive to read them, but it's easy once you know it. The lower the Kelvin count, that's what color temperature is measured in, Kelvin or K. The lower it is, the warmer that your image will appear to be, or the warmer that the light actually is. So there's sort of these global standards where a tungsten light is 3200 Kelvin, natural daylight is 5600 Kelvin, and that's just another arbitrary example on the slide there, at 10,000 Kelvin. That would be really, really cold and cool looking and blue, basically. Now, basically, yeah, okay, I explained that. In practice, essentially, tinkering with your white balance is, you know, it's a creative decision. But if you're interested in getting the most accurate colors to your scene, you're going to want to adjust your white balance to match the lights that are present in your scene. So if you're in a room that only has 3200 Kelvin tungsten lights, if you set your camera to 3200 Kelvin as well, then something that should be white is going to appear to be white rather than, you know, like a warm yellow. Because to your eye, that 3200 Kelvin room is going to look yellow and warm and cozy, to be fair. But in the interest of taking an accurate photo, you would need to compensate for that. Again, this is not a necessary step. Sometimes you want your photo to look like what your eyes saw, like say a lantern festival where everyone is lighting candles and letting these lanterns float into the sky. You don't want it to be like super, super cold and white and uncharacteristic. These are candles, and candles are romantic. They can help tell a story. So you want them to look warm. You would, in that case, not adjust your white balance. Different cameras often have different presets for white balance. Let me see here. Let me dig into my own settings real quick. I have them right here. My camera specifically has presets for daylight, shade, cloudy, incandescent, cool white, underwater even. I don't know when I would use that. This thing is very much not waterproof. But basically, you can adjust this very much, and there's a lot of control. There's a lot of flexibility. Honestly, auto white balance is often a totally fair move. It's great for run and gun, street photography, or, you know, taking pictures of your kids running through different rooms of the house with different lighting setups. Modern cameras are really great at that. And in addition to that, white balance is probably one of the easiest things to fix in post, you know, quote unquote. To adjust it in editing is relatively easy. And so I don't worry about it necessarily as much as these other elements of taking a photo. But it's something absolutely to be aware of. Now, practical examples of white balance shifting. I believe I took this at daylight, the daylight preset. You'll see, you know, just to sort of register how it looks. This was at 5500 Kelvin in a room with perhaps slightly warmer than that style lighting. This was probably taken with my shade preset or incandescent preset. Yeah, I think incandescent. So incandescent is what it sounds like. That's like, I don't know, taking a picture of a candle, like I mentioned. Um, there were no candles in this scene. There were no lights that were as warm as a candle. So you see that the consequence of that is my photo is now super, super cold and almost lifeless looking. Again, that's a creative choice. Maybe that's something you want. If you're taking like a staged photo of an apocalyptic zombie scene, or you want it to be like in a war-torn sort of environment, then you want a certain color temperature to that. So this is like extra warm. I think this was taken with the shade preset because shade tends to be cooler than exposed daylight. Fun fact. And then this is just another one. It's a little more magenta cast. So you can see with the same lighting, but changing your Kelvin settings, you can get different feels and different atmospheres out of your photos. All right, so to recap, focus, focal length, and white balance. Focus can help you tell a story by determining what is sharp and what isn't. You can explore the possibilities of manual focus. You can put a relatively large amount of trust in modern cameras' autofocus. Phones these days have great autofocus. And something I should have mentioned at the beginning, by the way, is obviously phones don't have interchangeable lenses. Obviously phones don't have like a manual focus dial, but there are certain, you can look it up, and there are certain apps that allow completely manual control of the lens for, say, I'm not sure for Android, but for iOS, there's like Camera Plus or Halide Photo. And they enable you to change the ISO and the white balance and the shutter speed and everything within that app. In a lot of cases, if you're, again, iPhone is what I use, so that's my example. There's so much that is done automatically if you're just using the standard camera app. And that's fine, like it works, and that's why they make it that way. They don't want you to have to think about that stuff. But here, we are thinking about that stuff because it helps to know why these settings do what they do and what they can do. So just keep that in mind. Focal length. Focal length is a characteristic of every lens. It determines how much it zooms in and how large the subject is in the frame. A wider lens can give you context and create space between your subject and your background and tell a broader story, which also brings distortion into play, as I mentioned. Think fisheye. And then longer lenses can help isolate your subject from the background by just totally blurring out the background and reducing the apparent space between you or rather your subject and the hypothetical Eiffel Tower behind them. If you want something in the background to look larger, use a longer lens. If you want something into the background to look smaller, use a wide lens. And then just recently, white balance determines the warmth and the coolness of your image. And there is really no wrong way to go about doing that. It's all ultimately creative license. It's you telling a story with your image. So now we move on to something that goes beyond the controls of your camera. This is the other half of creating a nice looking, well-exposed image. And it is keeping in mind the external and interior lighting of your scene. We touched upon this with white balance. Basically, the way that your scene is lit is like, honestly, I find it to be more important in a lot of cases than what gear you have. They say the best camera that you have is the best camera for you is the one that you have. But the thing that you can control beyond that is how your photo is lit, how your subject is lit. Obviously, if you're running and gunning and you just on the street, or again, you're taking a picture of your dog in the yard and your kid in the kitchen, you don't have much control over the light and you're not going to think about that kind of thing. You're just going to get the shot, and that's fine. But I'm going to ask you to keep a couple things and a couple principles in mind so that hopefully you're going to get more sort of, for lack of a better word, cinematic images. So I have a couple samples to go with each of these principles. We have first backlighting. I have found with almost, I don't want to make it a hard fact, but I have found with almost universal success that backlighting your image is going to make them pop more and make them just come alive and tell a more detailed story, so to speak. Again, my practical example is this. I shot this in another parking lot with some friends, and it was very dark except for this one street light, basically. And I sort of blasted the exposure enough to blow out the street light, but not enough to blow out the shadows of my friends here or they themselves. But you see that because they're backlit, they have a very sharp and detailed silhouette. And that's very striking. You know, you can't really see much detail about, like, you know, what they're wearing or what the colors of what they're wearing, but their silhouettes are so striking and they stand out from the background in spite of being just as dark as the background, really. And, you know, that is certainly a valid mode of separating your subject from the background, even if your lighting is challenging. And of course, this like blown out highlight looks kind of cool. It looks kind of like an artificial sun, basically, because that's its function in this photo. Now, another very fun and important principle to a lot of photographers is bokeh. Bokeh is the name of those balls of light, basically, that show up in the background of a lot of photos you may see. And it's a very aesthetic look. It's a natural result of the physics of the lens. I'm trying to find quickly an example of it. I think it might not have imported. But that being said, there should be an example of it that I can bring up here. We'll go back to this image again. Like this ball of light compared to my friend here was like several hundred yards away. And because of that, it's way out of focus and it creates a unique shape that a lot of people find to be aesthetic. It's a desirable trait for portrait photography, and getting a shallow depth of field is key to that. And you know what? Give me a second here, please. I will attempt to import very quickly an image that demonstrates this. I definitely have one prepared here. But y'all can take a breather. Oh, okay, here. Let me see. Lightroom, import. No, that was kind of interesting.
In the meantime, if anybody's got any questions, you know, feel free to drop them in the chat and I can relay them. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Please, Nicole, help me.
You're the pro, man. But yeah, so if anybody at any point has any questions, you know, put them in the chat. Either we can get to them at the end or I can just kind of relay them. So
absolutely.
Either way.
I guess here you guys are getting a sneak peek of some of the photos that I've taken in my time. Let me see here. There's some more luxury pens, because of course. Okay, actually, you know what? I think I can just share a different window. I'm silly. I don't use Zoom that often, don't mind me. But okay, one sec here. I will stop the share. Hello again. And then let's share a different screen.
Yeah, and just to let everybody know, we'll probably put this up on YouTube over the next 2 days or so. So if you missed anything, we'll put it up so you guys can find it again.
All right, so perfect. Nicole, can you confirm that a photo of a girl is showing?
Looks good.
Cool. All right, so yeah, you can see this is a very obvious example of bokeh. These orange orbs of light, really. They were string lights that were just around this restaurant that was behind my friend Sydney here as we were doing a portrait session in Asbury Park. And they're incredibly blown out just by the nature of The depth of field that I was shooting at is very likely to be f1.8. And I was relatively close to Sydney when I took this photo. So that sort of just emphasized and increased the amount of blurriness that the background would have. And that results in these very aesthetic orbs of light. You can imagine there's a lot of great bokeh opportunities during Christmas time, or, you know, any sort of street life, nightlife scene downtown where there's tons of string lights everywhere. People love bokeh. Bokeh sells. I don't make the rules, so you can make your own judgments. But it's a fun thing to consider when you're taking aesthetic photos. Back to me, and then let me go back to my presentation. Okay, share screen and Lightroom. All good, Nicole?
You're good.
Cool. All right, so, okay, now, oh, what happened to the other imports? All right, I'm gonna have to do the switching around thing here and there, but I'll explain anyway. So we have soft light and hard light. These basically, there are two different kinds of light that can hit your subject in any given photo, really. And oh wait, I can do this. Never mind. That's it. So I have my examples here, perhaps. Yeah. So this portrait is soft light. You can see between the highlighted parts of my friend's face and the darkest parts of my friend's face, there is a soft gradation. Now, soft light is created when you have a hard light source that has to travel through a medium, like a bed sheet or a light dome, you know, something that you could buy. But if it's like the sun that's hitting through a window and then reflected off a white wall in your house, that'll also produce soft light. The thing with soft light is it's very, very often preferable to hard light when you're taking portraits of people. It's much more flattering. You get more contours of the face and the jaw or dimples, whatever you want emphasized. And it's more even, and it helps a lot to create a pleasing image in the very sort of conventional, societally determined way. And then let me see if I can find sort of a hard light. So, I mean, I guess for this image, it could apply. I was using a soft light, but it was at an angle in such a way that it produced, you know, harsh shadows and lines. And, you know, I mentioned that soft light tends to be more aesthetic, but ultimately, again, it's a creative decision. You know, there's a lot more contrast in this image. There's a lot more division between the dark parts and the light parts of her face, like especially at the chin. And this creates a dramatic look. It's more stark and it's more visceral. And that might be exactly what you want to achieve in your photo. Let me see. Another thing here. Oh, I mean, we can just sort of use this as an example too. This is me, and this is a soft light, but you can see it's outdoors. We had no lighting setup. This light is soft because it was an overcast day. So oftentimes, like, I will actually be very happy to have an overcast day forecast for a shoot or a session that I have that's going to be outdoors, because clouds are nature's soft box. Clouds are nature's bed sheet. The sun is too harsh, it's too bright for a lot of situations. And you'll see there's a very sort of pleasing fall off between the light parts and the dark parts of my face because the lighting is soft. Now, obviously this is hard light. The sun was totally unobstructed when I took this photo, so you're getting clear defined shadows. And obviously, because this isn't a photo of a person, this is less obvious, and it still functions as a well-exposed image. And through editing, you can make it something incredibly artful. But it helps always to think of the character of your image that is being determined by things like hard light versus soft light. And then lastly, windows are your friend. Windows are basically, it goes back to what I mentioned with hard light and soft light. As long as the sun isn't shining directly through a window, windows are a universal source of soft light. You want to take a nice portrait of someone, visiting family, anything, get them by a window. It almost, it sounds completely logical. It sounds like something you would assume inherently, but it bears mentioning. Let me see here. If there's any more that I could expand on that with. No, that's all good. So let me see my notes real quick. Thank you for your patience. Okay. All right, so I think that's that on sort of the information dump part of my presentation. Now I am going to actually go into my Lightroom and find some raw photos to edit. Let's say this one. And now I'm going to sort of demonstrate, you've taken the photo, you got a good exposure, something cool to look at, and now you want to make it a little bit cooler. You want to zhuzh it up. You want to give it a little juice, and we're going to edit it. So this is a photo that I took at a music video shoot that I shot a few weeks ago. And whether or not you're aware, it's worth mentioning that it was a Breaking Bad inspired shoot. It's really cool. And so while we had him dressed up in the scene, we took a moment to take some cool photos. So now you'll see that, again, I've used at least one important principle of mine, which is backlighting the subject. I completely blew out the window. I didn't care much for the detail outside the window. I only wanted it to be an element to create sort of a silhouette out of my subjects. But I think that the rest of the image could use a little brightening. So a lot of times, a way to increase the dynamic range of your camera, which is one of the first things we mentioned, is to increase the shadows in editing. So you'll see this is sort of like a very high contrast look here, but I'm making the shadows a little gentler and rolling down the highlights a bit. Maybe increase the overall exposure. I try to use the contrast like quite minimally, because really these four sliders, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, are your primary source of contrast. And just touch up the black point a little bit there. Now, if you're using Lightroom, these controls don't always translate to other editing software, but basically there's texture, clarity, and dehaze. Texture kind of introduces noise, but only specific areas and colors. If there's skin tones and exposed skin present in the image, you want to reduce the clarity of the texture a bit, and that'll make it smoother. Clarity does the same thing, but sort of globally to the image. So if I really crank the clarity here, you'll see that there's a lot more contrast in individual colors versus if I completely reduce the clarity. Now it looks like a very old, like 70s glowy film type vibe, which is not what we're going for if we want it to look like, more Breaking Bad-esque. So I think I'm actually going to increase the clarity a bit here just to give it some harsh definition.
Hey, real quick, what were the two apps that you suggested for taking pictures on an iPhone?
Yes, so there's Camera Plus, just the plus icon, not the word. And then there's Halide, which is Halide. That is what appears to me to be a very well-designed and effective manual control photo app with a lot of extra features built into it as well. So now I'm going to adjust the white balance of the photo. If you're here for that, you'll remember that white balance was a very easy thing to adjust in post, and you're going to see that here. It comes in the form of two controls, temperature and tints, which I do know are present in even like the built-in Photos app adjustments. You see you have a lot of control with your white balance here, but let's keep assuming that we want to create sort of the pessimistic, grody vibe that Breaking Bad can be known for. I'm gonna make it a little bit cooler, and I'm gonna make it a little bit greener. It kind of looks more industrial, more chemical-y, whatever that means to you. Let's see here. Yeah. You know, I'm glad to an extent that I don't have to preserve anyone's skin tones. Normally that's my main goal, is to preserve skin tones and adjust around that. But they're completely covered up, which means we can just focus on the sort of the cinematic look of the entire image. Vibrance kind of sort of intensifies the difference from one color to the next. And then saturation to sort of, you know, you've tweaked enough saturation sliders in your life, I'm sure. It's a global adjustment for the intensity of the color. And I think I'm actually going to increase it a bit just to make it pop. Now, this is not something you'll find easily in your standard photo editing apps, but this is the tone curve. Basically, this represents the darkest part of the image, and the top right represents the brightest part of the image. And all along it, ooh, let's totally break the image there. All along it, you can adjust the heights of every individual pixel, basically, on a graph, on a linear graph. Basically, every vertical line represents a pixel of this image. And so I'm making all the darkest half of the image even darker when I do this, while mostly preserving the light levels of the lightest half of the image. But that looks not great. So I'm going to just nudge it downward a bit. You'll see in a lot of tutorials, they call this making an S-curve, which is basically just a nice way of saying, or adding a soft level of contrast without making it too obvious. Another thing that I like to do personally is to lower the white point a lot. That's something you can also do here with the whites slider. What this does, it's a little hard to see here, but basically it reduces the brightest part of the image while still leaving it white. Like I'm not getting detail back, so to speak, but I'm reducing the overall brightness of the image. And that's sort of a characteristic that you can find on like old film photos. Film photos tend to be quite dark in their maximum brightness range. And, you know, if you're looking at this in a vacuum, yes, that still looks very bright, but the white point is going to be a lot dimmer on like Instagram than something like that. You see, now I'm going to make it obvious by just breaking the image. It's lowering, oh, even there. See, that looks wacky, and maybe there's an artistic application to bring it down that far. But I'm going to keep it here, just about there, to taste, just to the point of not breaking. Now, this section here, I tend to be very sparing with. It's the HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. Basically, the hue sliders, you're basically saying, if you're on the yellow slider, take every yellow pixel in this image and tilt it towards green, or tilt it towards orange and red. Or you can take every blue pixel and tilt it towards purple or blue, or rather green, sorry. And you'll see that doesn't really do much because there aren't really any blue pixels to begin with, but there are certainly a lot of yellow pixels. There's a lot of green, so you'll see that that can be changed. And this gives you a very fine level of control of all the individual colors of your image. Saturation, same principle. You can pick a specific color like yellow and only desaturate the yellows while very much saturating the greens. Now that looks weird and wonky, but you get the idea. And then again, with luminance, you can increase or decrease the brightness of specific colors. So now we're blowing out the greens, we're blowing out the yellows, and you'll see this is a lot more of a usable control here. Like I might actually want to do that just to bring out the subjects and make them pop more. Now, these controls, color grading, this is basically changing the color tilt of the areas of your image that are specifically dark or specifically bright, or the midtones, which is everything in between. So if I want my shadows to be more warm, then I will bring the slider towards red. And now I can change the color of the shadows after the fact. So I'm only adjusting the color shift of the darkest parts of the image because this is the shadows wheel, and I can bring it down, sort of deep fry them basically in my terminology. So I'm just going to reset it. I don't want to adjust it too much. I think I'm pretty happy with the balance that we're going for, given that we want it to be like this weird green chemical vibe. Now, as I mentioned before, when we were talking about ISO and introducing noise to your image, of course, here you have noise reduction. Now, you'll see here, this image is taken at ISO 1600, so there's a decent bit of noise, you can tell. It's not a deal breaker, so to speak, but if we want it to be insanely clean, we can crank up the noise reduction, and you'll see that now it's very smooth. But I think we went too far, because now you see that the sort of the complexion of these hazmat suits has gone pasty. We've lost detail. And you'll see immediately when I reduce the noise that now you can see way more of the folds and individual details of the hazmat suits. So I'm going to go sparing on the noise, if not entirely present. And that'll just clean it up slightly, because I kind of like having a little character. And you'll notice I'm kind of,
sorry, just
excuse me,
FYI,
yes.
sorry. It's 8:30. I mean, you can finish. I just want to let you know, time check, that's all.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. All right, so you'll notice that I skipped a decent bit of these sliders. I guess I would just encourage you to sort of play with them to taste. They adjust a lot of specific little things, and I'll be the first to admit that I don't always notice the difference in the final image when you're all the way zoomed out, or if you're on a mobile phone, because a lot of the work that I do ends up just being displayed for Instagram. But that's the nature of the beast. Make your own way. Now, real quick, you have two settings here, remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. If I do profile corrections, you'll see the image changes somewhat, the corners become brighter, and it becomes a little less distorted. That's just a built-in thing. Lightroom can recognize what camera and what lens you used, and every single lens is going to have a little bit of distortion. And this is sort of an automatic way to get rid of it. It's not necessary. I kind of like the sort of vignette, and vignette is when the edges of the image are dark. And then chromatic aberration is, well, it's not necessarily applicable to this image, but basically it cleans up the edges of dark objects on bright backgrounds and stuff like that. Sometimes lenses can have like a magenta or a green shift in the edges, and that's just sort of the imperfections of certain lenses. This is to combat that. And then, like I mentioned before, just now, this is vignette. It obviously, with a vignette like this, you're bringing the attention way towards the center of the photo, or the opposite can happen. This is this looks a bit like some sort of holiday card, so we're going to avoid that because we want a dark vibe. And then grain. Grain is interesting because it's introducing noise back into the image, but it's not the same as ISO noise. It's more like a simulated film noise, because back in the day when we used film cameras, different films would have different noise patterns. And a lot of the time, especially now, with like the advent of vintage things coming back into style, people like their noise. And I have to admit to you that I add a lot of noise using this function back into a lot of the images that I deliver, because it gives it sort of an older world aesthetic. It makes it look like I took it with a film camera. And a lot of people like that. Many professional photographers complain that most modern cameras are too sharp, too clear, too clinical, and they like the character of grain. And I know that sounds a little pretentious. I would liken it to people who prefer vinyl over, streaming music. There's just something to it, and that's worth exploring on your part, just to have options. The last thing here is calibration. This is sort of another way to control specific levels, specific colors in the image. So right here, I'm taking the blues and I'm shifting them towards a teal, except this actually affects everything in the image and not just the blues as well. I can also reduce the saturation here. Something I do almost universally is reduce, or I tilt the blue towards teal in my images, and then I reduce the saturation of the blue. It just sort of makes the reds a little more orange overall, and I find that to be an aesthetic practice. So this is sort of my standard loadout. I tilted the shadows towards green. I made the reds a little more orange, and I made the greens a little more blue. And that's sort of like, you know, you can figure out your own recipe for what looks good, but I'm sort of giving you a peek at mine. I'm going to bring the contrast up a little bit more. And you'll see that what I just did kind of normalized the image a bit. So I am going to bring back the industrial green. You know, a lot of this is just a balancing act, really, of all these millions of different little sliders or whatever settings you have on your phone to arrive at a point where, you know, you're happy. And I think I'm happy with this. This kind of it emulates the story, really. It emulates the story of Breaking Bad. And if I do this little backslash here, you'll see that's what we started with, and that's what we ended with. I wanted to get a gritty and pessimistic looking vibe out of this image, and I think we've arrived at that point. And another thing to mention, this was taken with a wide angle lens, 24 millimeters. So I've given context, I've set them in a kitchen. If it was an 85, I would only be seeing them and you wouldn't see that they were in a kitchen cooking, so to speak. And yeah, I shot this at 1/125th of a second. I had a steadier hand that day because this wasn't on a tripod, but obviously I was able to do a lot in post, no matter what the exposure was in the end. I don't know if, Nicole, you want to open it up for even just a minute for a couple questions, if there are any.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we got a few minutes
happy
left.
to say.
Yeah, so I mean, again, so we'll put this on YouTube. Sometimes it takes a while to process. We have to try to trim it a little bit here and there. So it'll be up tomorrow, the next day, most likely. So for anybody, again, if you missed something, you want to go back and look at something else, it'll be up, you know, take a look. I think you can find our YouTube. There's a link to it on our website in various places. But yeah, if anybody else has any questions before we wrap it up, you know, drop it in the chat.
Yeah.
How long have you been how long have you been How long have you been photographing?
I have been photographing professionally for like 2.5, maybe 3 years now. I've had like a camera to use for longer than that, you know, because before that I was just a very casual hobbyist. I had like this Canon T3. It was great. It did the job, and it planted the seeds in my mind. I mentioned this at the beginning of my presentation, I think, while you were on the phone, that, you know, I had that through college when I was doing graphic design, and getting to use it for some non-graphic design related projects on like my other classes sort of awakened me to the idea that I could do something serious with cameras. And it wouldn't be until like many years later that I would start having the confidence really to take on professional photography.
Well, everything I've ever seen you do has been so great, and I'm
I
so
appreciate
happy that you did this. Yeah, so thank you guys for coming. Thank you again, Kris. It was very informative.
Of course.
I've
Thank
owned
you so
various
much.
cameras throughout the years and was very intimidated by them, and I think I even learned a lot here.
I'm so glad.
A couple people in the chat thanking you. But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. I know there's a little bit of a hiccup at the start there, but we figured it out. So glad everybody could make it. So glad you did this for us, Kris. But yeah, guys, so if you're interested in more programming, check our calendar. You know, maybe Kris will be back in a few months, you know, when our calendar opens up a little bit again. And yeah, happy photographing. I almost said photographing, but there you go. But yeah, thank you again, Kris. So good to have you. Thank you again for coming. Be safe, everybody. Be well. We'll catch you next time.
A pleasure.
Take it easy.
Thank you.